They called Rome the Eternal City, a beacon of civilization, but beneath its marble skin festered an empire of shadows. Its wealth was never earned. It was taken, torn from the hands of the conquered, ripped from the ruins of cities that once stood proud, and stacked high in the vaults of men who wore the faces of statesmen but lived as predators. Behind the solemn gaze of statues and the blinding gleam of triumphal arches lurked jackals in togas, their polite words masking the hunger in their eyes, their smiles hiding teeth sharpened on the bones of the fallen. Every glittering coin that passed between their fingers carried the weight of suffering, the reek of burning towns, the cries of fields stripped bare by hungry legions, the silent rage of temples desecrated in the name of the Republic. These men were not leaders. They were architects of ruin, master builders of misery who could turn famine into profit and betrayal into law. They ruled without thrones, crowned only in fear, wielding gold not as a sign of success, but as a weapon of control, silencing dissent and rewarding loyalty with the spoils of plunder. And yet the city adored them, for the people saw only the marble facades and heard only the orations carefully crafted to sound like patriotism, never realizing that the greatness of Rome was a mask, one that hid the gaping maw of greed. For in truth, the Republic's most celebrated sons had built their fortunes not on stone or steel, but on the ash of burned villages, the sweat of enslaved hands, and the bones of those who dared to resist. This is their story, the story of kings without crowns, tyrants without titles, and the darkness they cast that still stains the pages of history. Chapter 1. Crassus, the man who bought Rome's soul. They whispered that Marcus Licinius Crassus did not just own half of Rome, he owned its shame, its suffering, its dead. His fortune was not built in the bustling marketplaces or by honest trade. It was forged in the choking smoke of burning homes, in the screams of men dragged from their doorsteps, in the tears of widows who signed away their lives to survive. Crassus, Rome's richest man, was not a merchant of goods. He was a merchant of misery. His first and greatest source of wealth came from one of the most sinister practices ever tolerated in the empire: the buying and looting of burning property. When a fire broke out in Rome, most citizens panicked, desperate to save their families and their meager possessions. But Crassus, cold and calculating, sent his private army of slaves, not to help, not to put out the flames, but to corner the desperate owners. Surrounded by smoke and ruin, they were offered a cruel bargain: sell their property to him at a fraction of its worth, or watch it burn to ash. And even if they agreed, Crassus didn't save the house out of kindness. He saved it because he knew it could be rebuilt, resold, and exploited. His private firefighting force, made up of hundreds of trained slaves, carried buckets and tools not to serve Rome, but to serve his greed. They would stand idle while flames consumed the homes of the stubborn, only acting when the ink was dry on the contract. By the time the fire was out, Crassus would own another street, another block, another chunk of the city, all bought at the price of desperation. But fires were not enough for Crassus. His appetite for gold and land was bottomless, and so he fed it with war. When the Third Servile War erupted and Spartacus led his army of escaped slaves across Italy, Crassus saw not just a threat but an opportunity. The Senate begged for someone to crush the rebellion, and Crassus took the command, not for Rome's safety, but for the spoils of victory. He funded the war out of his own wealth, knowing the repayment would come in gold, land, and the sale of thousands into slavery. But it was not victory that stained his name. It was the cruelty he used to make Rome fear him. After defeating Spartacus, Crassus ordered 6,000 captured rebels crucified along the Appian Way, their bodies left to rot for miles as a warning to anyone who dared rise against the wealthy. The crucifixions were not just punishment. They were a performance, a theater of death staged by a man who understood that fear could be more profitable than generosity. Those who survived the war and were sold into slavery found themselves in mines, quarries, and farms owned by Crassus himself, their labor feeding the same empire that had crushed them. In this way, his war was not just a military victory, it was a business venture, a slaughter turned into profit. Yet the darkest secret of Crassus's fortune was not in the flames of Rome or the blood on the Appian Way. It was in the betrayal of his own city. Crassus lent money to Rome's most powerful politicians, but his loans came with invisible chains. Those who could not repay him found their votes, their influence, and even their families in his grip. Through these debts, he did not simply grow richer, he controlled elections, manipulated laws, and ensured that Rome's government served his ambitions. Some whispered that even the young Julius Caesar owed his rise to Crassus's gold, that every victory Caesar claimed was paid for with money stolen from the desperate and the dead. And if a senator or noble resisted, Crassus had other ways. Bribes could become threats, threats could become scandals, and scandals could destroy reputations faster than any sword. He built his wealth like a spider spins a web, each thread a debt, a favor, or a ruin, and those caught in it never escaped. This endless hunger for more drove him to one last, fatal gamble, the Parthian campaign. Here in the dust of the East, the man who had bought Rome's soul sought to buy its glory. But greed is a blade that cuts both ways. Crassus ignored advice, pushed his men into the desert without enough water, and marched them into an ambush. The Parthian arrows tore through his army, his dream of conquest bleeding into the sand. Legend says that when he was finally captured, the Parthians mocked his endless lust for gold by pouring molten gold down his throat. A gruesome joke for a man who had spent his life consuming wealth as if it were air. Whether that tale is truth or myth, it became the perfect ending for the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man so consumed by greed that in the end it consumed him. Even in death, his legacy was not honor but fear. In the streets of Rome, his name was spoken not with admiration, but with the kind of bitter respect one gives a predator. For Crassus proved something darker than any battlefield could. He showed that in Rome, a man could rise higher through cruelty than through courage, and that the empire's heart could be bought, one burning house at a time. His fortune, once envied, became a symbol of everything corrupt in the Republic, a reminder that wealth gained through suffering leaves a stain that no gold can cover. The Senate tried to erase his failures, but the people remembered. They remembered the black smoke curling over the rooftops while his men stood waiting for a bargain. They remembered the miles of crucified bodies swaying in the wind. They remembered the whispers of politicians bending under his debts. And they remembered that when Rome burned, Marcus Licinius Crassus did not bring water. He brought a contract. Chapter 2. Lucius Licinius Lucullus, the banquet king who fed on blood. They called him a connoisseur, a patron of art, a lover of fine banquets. But the truth was far more rotten than the grapes in his overflowing wine bowls. Lucius Licinius Lucullus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, wrapped his darkness in silk and silver, hiding the stench of where his fortune truly came from. Beneath the perfumes of his gardens and the gold-leaf ceilings of his dining halls lay the screams of dying soldiers, the smoking ruins of stolen kingdoms, and the cold betrayal of allies who trusted him. His dark secret was simple yet monstrous. Every feast, every jewel, every imported delicacy in his lavish villas was bought with the spoils of blood-soaked conquest. While Rome praised him for his military skill, Lucullus had perfected something far more profitable than strategy. He had mastered the art of war as a business. In the wars against Mithridates VI of Pontus, Lucullus plundered not as a servant of the Republic, but as a predator of empires. Cities that surrendered were stripped of their treasures. Those that resisted were wiped from the map, their wealth dragged back to Rome in caravans guarded by his soldiers. And once the treasures arrived, they did not go to the public coffers. They went to Lucullus himself, who treated the empire's spoils as his personal bank. Lucullus's cruelty was not only on the battlefield, it bled into the lives of the people under his control. In the East, where his campaigns brought him face to face with kingdoms rich in gold, spices, and slaves, he turned the conquered into an endless source of revenue. Farmers were taxed until they starved. Their grain ceased to feed his armies and his banquets. The women of these territories, stripped of their status and homes, were paraded in Rome as exotic prizes, sold to the highest bidder or kept as ornaments in his estates. Lucullus understood that conquest did not end with victory. It continued in the quiet, grinding exploitation of the defeated. Even when peace treaties were signed, he placed crippling financial demands on the conquered rulers, forcing them to send yearly shipments of gold, jewels, and luxury goods directly to him. These were not official Roman taxes. They were personal tributes to the man who had destroyed their armies. And if any ruler hesitated or tried to negotiate, Lucullus's soldiers returned to remind them what defiance cost. His greed grew into an obsession with luxury so extreme that even the corrupt Roman elite were shocked. Lucullus built palatial estates along the Bay of Naples, where the walls were lined with precious marbles from every corner of the empire, each piece a silent witness to the lives crushed to obtain it. His gardens were so vast that they required artificial rivers, stocked with rare fish imported at staggering expense, some transported alive from as far away as the Black Sea. But the darkest of his indulgences lay in his legendary banquets. For Rome's elite, a feast was a display of power, and Lucullus's tables became stages for his wealth. He served flamingo tongues, peacock brains, and fruits out of season, delicacies only possible through a network of slaves who died in the fields, ports, and kitchens to keep his plates full. It was whispered that he kept entire villages of fishermen working exclusively for him, their lives worth nothing more than the exotic catch of the day. Guests would marvel at the spectacle, but few cared to ask how many lives were spent so one man could taste the ocean in a single bite. The scale of his spending became a sickness, one that drove him to invent new forms of excess simply because no one else had done them. He built underground channels to bring seawater into artificial ponds for rare fish, not for public use, but for his own entertainment. When his fortune from the Eastern wars began to dwindle, he turned to another dark source of income, money lending at a scale so ruthless it destroyed entire families. Lucullus lent to desperate aristocrats, charging interest so crushing that repayment became impossible, and when they defaulted, he took their estates. Many of these estates had been in the same families for generations, only to be devoured by a man whose appetite for wealth could never be sated. It was said that even other moneylenders, men hardly known for mercy, found his terms excessive. But Lucullus did not care about reputation. He cared about possession. Every loss for someone else was a gain for him, and by the end of his career, his private properties rivaled the holdings of the Roman state. Perhaps the most disturbing truth about Lucullus was that his cruelty was not born out of necessity, but out of desire. He did not need more wealth. By any reasonable measure, he had more than enough to live in opulence for 10 lifetimes. Yet he continued to take, to destroy, to hollow out lives because the act of acquisition thrilled him. For him, conquest was not just a means to an end, it was the end itself. His military campaigns, his political dealings, his private trades, they were all part of a game in which he alone could win, and everyone else had to lose. Even his allies were not safe. He betrayed them when it suited him, undermining their influence in the Senate or ruining their reputations when they threatened to outshine him. Those who had fought beside him found themselves discarded, their contributions minimized, their rewards stolen. To Lucullus, loyalty was nothing but a tool to be used and then broken. In the end, Rome remembered Lucullus less for the victories he claimed than for the decadence he embodied. His later years were spent almost entirely in his estates, surrounded by luxury so excessive that it turned grotesque. He became a living symbol of the corruption rotting the heart of the Republic, a man who had turned war into private enterprise and conquest into personal theater. And though he died in his bed, far from the battlefield, the shadows of his fortune followed him. Every banquet he ever hosted, every marble column in his villas, every jewel in his treasury was a silent monument to the suffering that paid for it. The poets called him a patron, the aristocrats called him a gentleman, but the poor, the conquered, and the forgotten knew the truth. Lucius Licinius Lucullus was not the banquet king. He was the butcher of empires, and his gold was stained with more blood than any battlefield could ever wash away. Chapter 3. Gaius Julius Caesar, the tyrant who bought an empire with blood. Before the laurel wreath, before the marble statues, before his name became a legend, Gaius Julius Caesar was drowning in debt, and the way he clawed himself out left a trail of darkness Rome preferred not to see. His greatest secret was that his rise to power was funded not by noble service to the Republic, but by a ruthless exploitation of war, plunder, and betrayal so vast it turned him from a desperate politician into the most feared man in the Mediterranean. Behind the glory of his conquests was an economy of death, an unending cycle in which men were slaughtered so he could fill his war chest. Women were sold into slavery to buy loyalty in Rome, and entire nations were stripped bare to finance his hunger for control. Caesar's wealth was not born in the markets of Rome or the quiet patience of investment. It was torn from the hands of the conquered, stolen from temples, cities, and corpses. His campaigns in Gaul, celebrated in history for their brilliance, were in truth a years-long operation of extraction, the systematic bleeding of a continent to feed one man's ambition. Every fortress he took, every tribe he crushed, became another coin in his vault, another bribe to senators, another gift to soldiers whose loyalty could be bought as easily as bread. The Gallic Wars were the crucible in which Caesar's fortune was forged, but they were also where his cruelty reached its most chilling heights. In one campaign, he destroyed the city of Avricum, ordering the slaughter of nearly all its inhabitants, men, women, and children alike, leaving fewer than 200 survivors out of a population of 40,000. The reason was not strategy or revenge. It was to send a message and to strip the city's wealth without fear of revolt. He looted its granaries to feed his armies, took its gold and silver for his treasuries, and sold thousands into slavery. For Caesar, the bodies left rotting in the streets were not tragedy. They were proof that fear was the fastest path to profit. This pattern repeated across Gaul. The plunder of cities financed the next battle brought more plunder, and the cycle fed itself until his power was unshakable. And yet even this was not enough. When the Gallic resistance under Vercingetorix fell, Caesar staged his surrender as public theater, chaining the chieftain and parading him in Rome before strangling him in the depths of the Tullianum prison. The spectacle served as both a warning and a celebration. The defeat of a king turned into a festival, paid for by the very loot his people had died to protect. But the darkness of Caesar's wealth extended far beyond the battlefield. His early career was built on calculated alliances with Rome's most corrupt power brokers, men like Marcus Licinius Crassus, who paid off Caesar's debts in exchange for political favors. This meant Caesar's loyalty was never to the Republic itself, but to the system of patronage and corruption that made his rise possible. Every province he governed became a personal revenue stream, where taxes were inflated and public funds mysteriously disappeared into private accounts. In Spain, before his Gallic triumphs, he extorted local cities to finance his political campaigns, threatening them with military force if they failed to comply. To him, governorship was not an office of service, it was a license to steal, and he wielded it without hesitation. One of his most profitable, yet least discussed ventures was the large-scale slave trade his conquest produced. Every campaign swelled the Roman slave markets with new captives, and Caesar took his share of the profits personally. These human spoils were not merely byproducts of war, they were part of his strategy. In one instance, after the siege of Oxellodunum, he ordered the hands of captured defenders to be cut off before sending them into slavery, ensuring that their physical mutilation would serve as both a warning and a mark of their defeat. Such acts were not driven by military necessity but by a calculated cruelty designed to make resistance seem hopeless and to ensure that the slave trade remained an efficient, fear-driven industry. The money poured into Rome like a river of blood, and Caesar used it to buy the one thing he valued above all: loyalty. His soldiers were paid handsomely and rewarded with lands seized from enemies, creating an army that fought not for the Republic, but for him personally. Senators and magistrates received bribes disguised as gifts, ensuring they voted in his favor and shielded him from prosecution. Even the public benefited from his largesse. Lavish games, free grain, and extravagant spectacles kept the mob adoring him, blind to the fact that their entertainment was purchased with the spoils of mass death. This manipulation of Rome's people was as much a part of his fortune as the gold in his vaults. By the time he crossed the Rubicon, declaring war on the Senate itself, his war chest was so vast that he could fund an entire civil war without emptying it. During the civil war against Pompey, Caesar's hunger for wealth grew sharper still. He seized the treasuries of cities loyal to Pompey, confiscated estates from political enemies, and plundered temples for their offerings. The Temple of Saturn, which held Rome's reserve gold, was emptied under his orders, a sacrilege in the eyes of many, but a necessity for a man who intended to buy the future. And once Pompey was defeated, Caesar showed no mercy to his enemies. Those spared execution were often stripped of their estates, their fortunes absorbed into his own. The Republic was no longer merely corrupt. It had been purchased outright by one man, and the price had been paid in blood, faith, and freedom. The greatest irony was that Caesar cloaked this greed in the language of reform. He forgave debts he had often arranged in the first place, earning the gratitude of the public while quietly securing their dependence. He enacted land reforms, lands he had stolen from the defeated, gaining a reputation for generosity that hid the brutality of his acquisitions. Even his assassination did not end the power of his fortune. His vast wealth, seized through decades of war and plunder, passed into the hands of his heir, Octavian, who would become Augustus and use that same gold to turn the Republic into an empire. In the end, Caesar's true legacy was not the glory of Rome's expansion, but the proof that wealth, when soaked in enough blood, could buy anything: armies, laws, loyalty, and even immortality. Statues still rose in his honor, coins still bore his face, and the people still cheered his name, never caring to ask whose homes had been burned, whose children had been sold, and whose gods had been robbed to make it all possible. To the victors, history is written in marble and gold. But in Caesar's case, that marble is veined with the red of those who paid for it, and that gold still whispers the names of the dead. Chapter 4. Marcus Antonius, the Prince of Lust and Plunder. Long before poets romanticized his doomed love with Cleopatra, Marcus Antonius, better known as Mark Antony, had already carved his fortune out of the flesh of the dying republic. The polished marble of his estates, the silks that draped his shoulders, the overflowing goblets in his feasts, all of it was paid for with the spoils of cruelty, betrayal, and an insatiable thirst for wealth that bled provinces dry. His darkest secret was that while he played the role of a soldier and statesman, he was, at his core, a predator who saw Rome's wars not as matters of honor or duty, but as sprawling markets of plunder. Every campaign he joined, every alliance he forged, was measured not in victories, but in the golden land they could yield. The man celebrated as a loyal ally to Julius Caesar was, behind the scenes, a scavenger of the Republic's dying body, stripping it for parts and selling its soul to the highest bidder. His name became synonymous with excess not because of love or luxury alone, but because of how he fed those appetites, through calculated exploitation of war, politics, and people. One of Antony's earliest and most profitable moves came after Caesar's assassination, when chaos gripped Rome. As consul and one of the most powerful men in the city, Antony seized control of Caesar's papers and treasury. Publicly, he claimed to be defending Caesar's will and legacy. Privately, he altered documents, redirected funds, and distributed rewards only to those who could serve his ambitions. Estates of the conspirators, many of them vast and ancient, were confiscated and sold, with the proceeds swelling his personal coffers. Even the gold and silver intended for Caesar's public works quietly disappeared into Antony's vaults. While the Senate scrambled to keep the republic intact, Antony used the crisis to enrich himself, turning political upheaval into a personal harvest. But the real wealth came not from Rome itself, but from the provinces, fertile lands far from the Senate's eyes where Antony's rule could operate without restraint. As governor of the eastern provinces, he imposed crushing taxes, far beyond what the republic had ever demanded. The grain that should have fed Rome was often diverted to his own agents, sold for inflated prices, and funneled back into his accounts. In cities that resisted, Antony's soldiers enforced compliance with brutality, seizing hostages and plundering treasuries. Temples, sacred to generations, were stripped of their gold and jewels. The offerings to the gods melted into coins stamped with his own image. Religious leaders who protested vanished into dungeons or were executed as traitors. The wealth of the East became the bloodstream of Antony's ambitions, funding not only his military campaigns but also the elaborate lifestyle that made him infamous. His relationship with Cleopatra, the seventh of Egypt, often painted as a romance, was as much a business partnership in plunder as it was an affair. Together they orchestrated the draining of Egypt's vast resources, turning the ancient kingdom into a bank for their joint ambitions. Cleopatra, with her own ruthless streak, provided Antony with access to Egypt's gold reserves, grain surpluses, and trade networks. In return, Antony gifted her Roman territories and the spoils of his conquest. They hosted banquets so extravagant they became legends, serving entire meals of rare fish, exotic game, and wines imported from the farthest corners of the known world. Each bite paid for by the starvation of the people whose resources they consumed. It was whispered that while Alexandria sparkled under their reign, villages in the Nile Delta withered, their harvests seized, their laborers driven into exhaustion, so the royal couple could host another night of indulgence. Antony's military campaigns were equally steeped in greed. His ill-fated invasion of Parthia was not solely a matter of geopolitics. It was a gamble for the kind of loot that could eclipse even the fortunes of Caesar and Crassus. The campaign failed catastrophically, costing tens of thousands of Roman lives, but not before Antony's forces sacked cities along the way, stripping them of treasure to cover the costs of his blunders. When he returned to the east to rebuild his power, he doubled down on extortion. Cities that had once been allies found themselves paying tribute under threat of annihilation. Governors in his service grew rich from bribes, knowing that loyalty to Antony was worth more than loyalty to the Republic. Perhaps the most chilling example of his greed came in the treatment of Armenia. Antony lured King Artabases II into a trap, promising an alliance, only to have him seized and paraded in chains before Cleopatra in Alexandria. Armenia was stripped of its wealth, its royal treasury emptied, and its people taxed into ruin. The king was later executed without trial, his head sent as a gruesome gift to Cleopatra. This was not diplomacy, it was piracy carried out with the seal of a Roman commander. The humiliation of Armenia served as a warning to every ruler in the East. Defy Antony, and your kingdom will not just fall, it will be devoured. In Rome, his critics painted him as a traitor, a man more Egyptian than Roman. And while much of that was political slander, the truth was that Antony had no loyalty except to himself. The Senate's authority meant nothing to him when it stood in the way of profit. He distributed provinces to his allies like spoils, not based on merit, but on the bribes and favors they offered. The more desperate the Republic became in its final years, the more Antony thrived, exploiting every crack in its foundations to feed his own empire within an empire. His end came at Actium, when his forces, weakened by mismanagement and overindulgence, fell to Octavian's fleet. But even in defeat, Antony's downfall was gilded. When he and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, they retreated into a palace still bursting with treasure, the last reserves of their years of plunder. His suicide has been romanticized for centuries, but the truth is that Antony died surrounded by the wealth of 1,000 ruined lives, his empire of greed collapsing not from justice, but from the sharper blade of his rival. History remembers Antony as a tragic figure, the warrior undone by love. But beneath the poetry lies a far darker truth. He was a man who turned provinces into personal treasuries, who looted temples and starved cities to throw feasts for the powerful, who measured the worth of an ally in gold and the worth of an enemy in how quickly they could be stripped bare. His legacy was not the passion that inspired poets, but the proof that in Rome's dying days, power and wealth could be bought with cruelty, and a man could dine like a god while the empire beneath him bled to death. Chapter 5. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the butcher who bought glory. Before statues carved his likeness into marble and poets laced his name with honor, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, was not the shining champion of the Republic that history's polished accounts would have you believe. His rise was painted in the blood of enemies and allies alike, his fortune built on the plunder of cities, the betrayal of comrades, and the quiet suffocation of those who stood between him and absolute power. The darkest secret of Pompey's wealth was that it came not from noble service to Rome, but from a deliberate pattern of manufactured wars, calculated sieges, and the ruthless exploitation of conquered lands. He was a master of taking credit for others' victories, ensuring that the spoils flowed into his own coffers, and he was willing to turn Rome's legions into instruments of private profit, long before he was called Magnus. Behind the armor and laurel wreaths was a man who measured the worth of a campaign not in stability for the Republic, but in the weight of the gold it delivered to his estates. Pompey's early career began under the shadow of Sulla, the dictator whose brutal prescriptions became a template for how Pompey would later treat those he defeated. Aligning himself with Sulla was less about ideology and more about opportunity. As Sulla confiscated the properties of his political enemies, Pompey was quick to claim his share, seizing estates, livestock, and slaves from families ruined by the regime's decrees. Those who lost their homes and lands to this political purge found their wealth funneled into Pompey's growing empire, often without him having to lift a sword in battle. He learned early that war could be waged in Senate halls as easily as on the battlefield, and that the spoils of politics could be as rich as those of conquest. But it was in the provinces that Pompey truly perfected the art of enrichment through cruelty. His campaigns in Sicily and Africa were billed as essential for Rome's stability, but for Pompey, they were opportunities to strip these lands of their resources. Sicily, Rome's breadbasket, was not just secured, it was squeezed dry. Grain was requisitioned at unfair prices, then sold back at inflated rates, with the profits lining Pompey's accounts. Wealthy locals who resisted had their estates seized under the guise of treason. In Africa, Pompey's legions plundered cities after their surrender, taking gold, silver, and jewels that were supposed to be sent to the Republic's treasury, but instead were diverted to his private vaults. The people of these lands were forced into servitude, their labor feeding Pompey's ambition, while their lives crumbled under the weight of Roman occupation. His most infamous accumulation of wealth came during the war against the pirates, a campaign that cemented his reputation as Rome's savior of the seas. Yet the truth beneath the legend was far murkier. Pompey was granted extraordinary powers over the Mediterranean, an unprecedented command that gave him authority over both naval and provincial affairs. The pirates, who had long been a nuisance to Rome's trade routes, were not just defeated, they were dismantled in a way that ensured Pompey could reap personal benefit. Many pirate leaders, instead of being executed, were quietly absorbed into his networks, their ships and goods redirected into his own operations. Vast caches of plunder, taken from years of pirate raids, never made it to the public treasury. Instead, Pompey redistributed this loot to his allies and clients, buying loyalty while keeping a substantial portion for himself. The campaign became less about protecting Rome and more about securing a maritime empire of influence and wealth that only he controlled. His eastern campaigns against Mithridates VI of Pontus and in Syria were equally tainted by greed. Pompey inherited much of the groundwork laid by others, including Lucullus, yet claimed the final victories and the spoils for himself. Cities in Asia Minor and the Levant were subjected to crushing tribute, their treasuries emptied under the guise of paying for liberation. Temples older than Rome itself were stripped of gold and sacred artifacts, many of which found their way into Pompey's private collection. He paraded his eastern conquests in Rome with a triumph so lavish that it stunned the city, displaying exotic animals, captured kings, and mountains of treasure. But this spectacle was not just a celebration. It was an advertisement for his power, bought with the suffering of conquered peoples whose homes and livelihoods had been dismantled to feed the Roman appetite for conquest and Pompey's own for luxury. The darker side of Pompey's dealings was not confined to foreign lands. In Rome itself, he played the political game with a cunning that made him as dangerous in the forum as on the battlefield. He used his vast wealth to buy influence, funding games, public works, and grain distributions to keep the masses loyal. But these acts of generosity were never free. They were investments. Senators and magistrates who accepted his patronage found themselves indebted to him, their decisions subtly shaped to serve his ambitions. When alliances no longer served him, he discarded them without hesitation, most famously seen in his alliance and later rivalry with Julius Caesar. The so-called First Triumvirate was less a partnership and more a calculated arrangement to maximize personal gain, with Pompey ensuring that his provincial commands and commercial ventures were protected. One of the most disturbing aspects of Pompey's wealth building was his treatment of prisoners and slaves. Conquered peoples were not just taxed, they were commodified. Entire populations were uprooted and sold into slavery, their value measured in the silver they could fetch at Roman markets. Skilled artisans were forced to work in his estates, their talents enriching him while they lived under chains. Even his celebrated resettlement of the pirates, often cited as an act of mercy, was designed to place their labor and resources under his control, integrating them into the Roman economy in ways that served him first and the state second. The veneer of Pompey's greatness began to crack as his rivalry with Caesar turned into open conflict. As the Civil War loomed, Pompey once again demonstrated his talent for self-preservation, disguised as public service. He evacuated the Senate and key supporters to Greece, taking with him not just Rome's political elite, but also vast sums from the state treasury. These funds, ostensibly meant to finance the war against Caesar, were also used to secure his own comfort and that of his inner circle during exile. Even in the shadow of impending defeat, Pompey ensured that his personal wealth remained intact, moving assets beyond Caesar's reach. Pompey's end came not on the grand stage of a Roman battlefield, but on the shores of Egypt, betrayed and murdered by those who saw more value in his corpse than in his alliance. The once great general, who had commanded armies and bent provinces to his will, died as a fugitive, seeking refuge with foreign rulers he had hoped to manipulate. His death was swift, but the legacy of his greed lingered. The estates, the treasures, the networks of influence. These were monuments not to a selfless servant of Rome, but to a man who mastered the art of using the Republic as a personal goldmine. Stripped of the marble facades and heroic verses, Pompey's story is one of opportunism at its most refined. He thrived in chaos, turned war into commerce, and wrapped his plunder in the language of patriotism. His greatness was not the greatness of virtue or sacrifice. It was the greatness of a predator who could smile as he drained the lifeblood of nations, who could stand in the Senate draped in the spoils of cities that no longer existed, and call it glory. Rome called him Magnus, but to the lands he conquered, he was the shadow that fell before the storm, the hand that reached into their temples and treasuries, the name that meant the end of freedom and the beginning of servitude. His empire was not the Republic's. It was his own, carved in the dark and paid for with the suffering of countless forgotten lives. Chapter 6. The Poisoned Gold of Gaius Verus. Long before his name was dragged through the Roman courts by the silver-tongued Cicero, Gaius Verus had already written his legacy in the screams of the exploited and the curses of the robbed. His darkest secret, known well to those who served him and feared to speak aloud, was that his wealth was not only stolen, it was stolen with an artistry so corrupt, so deliberately cruel, that even Rome's most seasoned profiteers regarded him with a mixture of awe and disgust. Verus was not simply a thief, he was a predator who wore the purple-edged toga of Roman authority, a governor whose appetite for plunder turned entire provinces into personal vaults and whose greed corrupted every oath he swore. The coins in his purse dripped with temple blood, the jewels on his fingers had been pried from the hands of statues of gods, and the grain in his storerooms was taken from starving mouths. If Crassus's fortune was fire and Lucullus's fortune was war, then Verus's fortune was pure rot, festering in the shadows of bureaucracy and drawn from the marrow of Sicily itself. When Verus was appointed governor of Sicily in 73 BC, it should have been a routine term of administration for the Republic's breadbasket. Instead, it became a 3-year orgy of extortion. His arrival was not marked by orders to improve the ports or strengthen the fields. His first act was to quietly install a network of loyal enforcers, men who would execute his will without question and without conscience. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were collectors, part bureaucrat, part brigand, skilled at squeezing wealth from every household and farm. Verus understood that a sword could kill, but a tax could drain a province dry without the need for open rebellion. He weaponized Roman law itself, twisting it into a tool for theft so thorough that no transaction, no shipment, no harvest in Sicily was beyond his reach. The temples were his first and most audacious targets. In city after city, Agrigentum, Syracuse, Enna, sacred shrines that had stood untouched for centuries, found their treasures stripped under the pretense of protection or loan. Priests who protested saw their families punished, their offerings seized, and their idols carted away under armed guard. Some statues, so beloved by the local populace they might have incited revolt, were spared from removal, but not from desecration. Verus demanded they be stripped of gold plating, gems, and ivory, leaving mutilated husks where gods had once stood in glory. These stolen relics were shipped to Rome, where Verus sold some to private collectors and kept others to ornament his estate, a grotesque gallery of piety turned profit. The cruelty of his taxation was legendary. Grain, the lifeblood of Sicily's economy, became his primary weapon. Roman law required Sicilian farmers to provide a set quota to the Republic at a fixed price. Verres inflated these quotas beyond reason, then forced farmers to sell the excess at ruinously low prices to his own agents. Those who refused had their land seized or their families enslaved. By manipulating weights and measures, he ensured that even those who met the quotas would owe more. The result was famine, not in a province famous for its bounty, but in the very fields that fed Rome. Meanwhile, Verus' warehouses swelled with stolen grain, sold at inflated prices to desperate merchants when shortages struck the mainland. But Verus' greed was not limited to goods. He trafficked in justice itself. No case was too small or too sacred to escape his interference. A man's innocence or guilt depended not on law, but on the size of the bribe placed in the governor's hand. He openly sold acquittals to murderers if their purses were heavy enough, while condemning the innocent to slavery or death if their estates tempted him. Merchants passing through Sicilian ports found themselves harassed by invented customs duties, payable only to Verus's coffers, while foreign envoys learned that diplomacy with the governor required tribute in silver and gold. The law was not merely bent, it was annihilated, replaced by the whim of a man who treated governance as a personal auction. Perhaps his most depraved crime was against the city of Syracuse. Verres coveted the city's art, a treasure trove of Greek sculpture, painting, and craftsmanship unrivaled in the Mediterranean. Under cover of darkness and legal decrees, he stripped Syracuse of its masterpieces, including works by Praxiteles and Zeuxis. Whole galleries were emptied, and the marble gods that had watched over the city for centuries were shipped across the sea to decorate his villa. To the people of Syracuse, these were not mere possessions, but the soul of their heritage. In taking them, Varus did more than plunder. He wounded the city's identity. His personal indulgences were as grotesque as his public crimes. Banquets on Varus' estates were infamous not for their refinement, but for their vulgar display of power. He dined from gold plates stolen from Sicilian temples, drank wine poured from amphorae, marked as property of the Roman state, and entertained guests with performers taken as tribute from provincial festivals. Artists, dancers, and musicians compelled to serve him without pay or freedom. He surrounded himself with luxury while the province he ruled sank into misery, and he seemed to revel in the knowledge that every drop of his pleasure came from someone else's ruin. The darkness of his fortune became so great that even Rome, accustomed to tolerating the excesses of its governors, could no longer look away. Reports of his crimes reached the ears of the Senate, but Varus was too skilled at buying silence. His bribes flowed as freely in Rome as they did in Sicily, securing allies among the powerful. When his term ended, he returned to the capital not as a disgraced thief, but as a man flaunting his spoils, certain that the Republic's corruption would protect him. It might have, if not for Cicero. The young advocate seized on Varus' case as a test of Rome's integrity, assembling a prosecution so meticulously documented that even the most corrupt senators found it difficult to ignore. Cicero's speeches painted Varus not merely as a greedy governor, but as a predator who had devoured a province. Witness after witness described the thefts, the desecrations, the starvation, and the legal atrocities. The evidence was overwhelming, but perhaps the most damning moment came when Cicero revealed that Varus' own agents had recorded the value of every item stolen. Proof that his crimes were not the result of chaos, but of careful, deliberate calculation. Faced with inevitable conviction, Varus fled into exile before the trial concluded. He took with him much of his fortune, escaping the formal punishment Rome might have imposed, but he could never escape the shadow of his infamy. In his comfortable retreat, far from Sicily's ruined fields and empty temples, he lived out his days surrounded by the treasures he had stolen. A man who had traded honor for gold and found the bargain worth it. Varus' story is the perfect coda to the lives of Rome's wealthiest and most corrupt. He did not build armies like Crassus or command legions like Pompey. He did not hide his crimes behind culture like Lucullus. Instead, he stripped the Republic's mask of nobility to reveal the rotting core beneath, showing that in Rome, power was just another word for the right to take. His fortune was poisoned from its birth, and yet, like so many of his peers, he wore it proudly, never once repenting, never once acknowledging the devastation he left behind. And that is perhaps the darkest truth of all. In the world of the late Republic, Gaius Varus was not an aberration. He was the rule. You've just strolled through Rome's gold-stained gutters and peeked into vaults stuffed with blood money, and you liked it. Don't deny it. So don't vanish like a guilty senator. Share this story, drag your friends into the filth, and stick around for more dives into history's dirtiest corners. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it sure was corrupted in one. Let's keep digging up the rot together. Rome fell once. Don't let its secrets die twice. Share the rot.